Welcome back to the lab, everyone. Today we're going to go over skull anatomy. Okay, let's start by looking at the major bones of the skull cap or calvaria. Remember, it's always best, I recommend at least, to orient yourself and use your directional terms before you just start learning these individual terms. That way you understand the context. So here, this is actually going to be the anterior side. This will be the posterior side, which means that when we turn it this way and we're looking at the anterior side, that this is the right and this is the left. So let's start with this first bone right here. This bone right here is called the frontal bone. Then this bone here on the side, that is the right parietal. It's important that you remember your rights and lefts. So that is the right parietal bone, which means this one, of course, would be the left parietal bone. Here on the occiput, or the back side of the head, is the occipital bone. What you cannot see here is the temporal bone, and I'll show that on a full skull, but the right temporal bone would be in this area right here. So now let's take a look at these lines. What are these lines? These lines are called sutures, and using your knowledge of body planes will really help you with the sutures. So this line right here is the coronal or frontal suture. Because my label is faced this way, I'll hold it as such. So this right here is the frontal or coronal suture. This actually fully fuses in the mid-20s. And if we have any issues with babies whose skulls are still growing, kind of like the misshapen skull, we call that plagiocephaly, and most of the time that's when we have a deformation in this area around the coronal suture. Then we have this suture right here. It goes right down the midline. We call that the sagittal suture, and that is named as such because it's on the sagittal plane. So whereas the coronal or the frontal suture is on that coronal plane, the sagittal suture is on the sagittal plane. And I know in class, we focus on mid-sagittal, something that's right down the middle. We just call this the sagittal suture. We have another suture. This kind of corresponds with the temporal bone. It's called the squamosal suture. But again, I'll point that out better on a different model where you can see the full context better. And then this one right here, by the occiput and the occipital bone, that is actually called the lambdoid suture. Now, this term, lambdoid, comes from the Greek letter lambda. So if you look at this, it kind of looks like a little mountain peak or an upside down V, and that is the basic shape of the Greek letter lambda. So maybe that will be a memory trick that'll help you remember this lambdoid suture. My biggest tip is just remember that the names of the bones are going to be these solid structures, and a suture is going to relate to these lines here. Why do we have these lines? Why do they zigzag as such? Well, remember, anytime we have lines or folds or zigzags, anything like that, that is going to create increased surface area. And if you were to imagine, if we just had a straight line down here, we would have much less bone from each parietal bone touching each other. When they zigzag across like this, that creates for a much stronger connection rather than just having this single line. So remember, form follows function. Why do we have these serrations or these zigzags? That actually makes this much stronger, and that's important because the calvaria, or the skull cap, is protecting our brain. So of course we would want to have that. Some interesting facts about the sutures. I talked about the coronal suture ossifying in the mid-20s. The sagittal suture will completely ossify sometime in our 30s or later. This lambdoid suture, mid-20s. But this squamosal suture, that actually happens in about our 60s. So it's kind of interesting, the differences of when these sutures actually ossify. It was just kind of interesting information. When you study the bones and the sutures, it makes your knowledge of the fetal features of the skull that much easier to understand. So study those in conjunction with one another, and you'll have a much better understanding of it. Okay, so here I just wanted to show you that I have the calvaria on top of the rest of the skull. And so here's the context of that squamosal suture. It kind of goes here, and this area right here would be the left temporal or temporal bone, which means this right here is the left squamosal suture. Okay, so let's look at the internal view of the skull. Here we have this kind of butterfly-shaped bone called the sphenoid. And there's a particular structure here that I'd like to draw your attention to, and that's this little dip in the bone called the sella turcica. And the sella turcica is an interesting spot because here we can start to imagine other organ systems, particularly the nervous system, involved with the bony features of the base of the skull. So this sella turcica, if you can see here, actually kind of goes inwards like this. Its nickname is the Turkish saddle. So what I like to ask students as well, what's sitting inside that Turkish saddle? And even though we haven't gotten to the nervous system in my class yet, at least, when we look at the brain and we learn about the pituitary gland, that pituitary gland is actually going to rest in this depression right here. So I like to point that out because it kind of helps you put multiple organ systems together. So again, the sphenoid, which is this butterfly-shaped bone right here, contains the sella turcica. The sella turcica is a specific part of the sphenoid. Anterior to that, so again, anterior because we're using this as a reference. Okay, right here, this is going to be the superior portion of the ethmoid bone. And the ethmoid bone has some things here that we can see. This part that is coming upwards like this, that is called the crista galli. Okay, so that's the crista galli. The depressions on either side of that crista galli are actually part of the cribriform plate. And the cribriform plate has the two depressions. Those are the olfactory fossa, and that's actually where the olfactory bulbs sit in. And again, if you haven't had the brain, if you haven't gone over the brain yet, or the nervous system yet, whenever you do, make note of that. Those two little bulb-like structures actually come up and they rest in those olfactory fossa. And then we have these perforations, these foramina, which means hole-like structures that are on the floor of the cribriform plate. So where it dips in and you see all these little dots, or on a 2D image, or holes, that is going to be representative of the cribriform plate. The reason why we have little holes here is because those are where the nerves from those olfactory bulbs, remember olfaction is your sense of smell, those are going to go through and actually come into the nasal septum here, and that's how we smell things, which is kind of interesting. So again, I know the base of the skull can be pretty intimidating, but those are just some of the major things I like to point out and tie to the nervous system because it helps you to put multiple organ systems together. Here we can also see that very large foramen magnum. Remember, a foramen is going to be a hole, kind of like that foramina, which are just tiny holes. So this is where the spinal cord, again, talking about that nervous system, the spinal cord will come out of the bottom of that skull. Okay, so here we have an inferior view. So anterior, this is going to be the left side, posterior. So now we're flipping it up like this. This is actually the view when you get transverse images on a CT scan. This is the view you're looking at. So here I just want to point a couple of things out. This is the palatine bone. This right here is the vomer. So I'll take these labels off so we can see a little bit better. But I wanted to start off with the label so you could tell where I was pointing to. So this right here, when we look at a frontal or coronal view of the skull, we'll point that out again. But this is the vomer. Other structures we can see here, these are actually going to be part of the zygomatic processes. So on this view, that was a zygomatic process. Here, same thing, just different perspective. And then these depressions right here. Remember, whenever we have a depression, we call that a fossa. And that is actually going to be the mandibular fossa. And because of the view we're looking at, remember that this is the left side. So this will be the left mandibular fossa. This will be the right mandibular fossa. And when I talk about the mandible and I go through the other parts of the skull, I will articulate it so you can see exactly how all of that fits together. Again, we have that foramen magnum. These structures right here are the occipital condyles. And a condyle is basically a knuckle-shaped structure. Okay, so you can see that kind of looks like a little knuckle there. And this is actually going to articulate with our atlas, our C1 vertebra. Okay, now let's take a look at the mandible. So the mandible is one entire bone. But remember, it's always helpful to remember your rights and lefts. So this would be the right. This would be the left side of the mandible. Remember that word foramen, which means hole or opening. So we have these two openings on either side of the mentis, which is the chin. So this sticker here is showing us the right mental foramen. And you think anytime we have holes in bones, most of the time it's because we're going to have blood supply or nerves that will run through those little passageways. So we have the right mental foramen and then the left mental foramen. Mental comes from that word mentis, which is the chin. Right here, I'm showing you one alveolus. And an alveolus, when we're talking about a skull, is going to be this bony socket. Okay, so all these little raised portions right here, those are going to be the alveoli, which is plural, for one single alveolus. So we will have alveoli in the mandible and on the maxilla as well. So going to this side, okay, we call this angle right here the ramus of the mandible. And we have two processes up here. This anterior one is called the coronoid process, and because we're on the left side of the body, this specifically will be the left coronoid process. And the posterior process will be the left mandibular condyle. Remember, condyle kind of refers to that knuckle shape, and we can see how that's a bit more rounded than this more pointed, thin process here. Another way you can remember this is think about how it articulates. So if I were to bring this skull right here, the mandibular condyle will fit into the mandibular fossa. Remember, a fossa is a depression. And the reason why we have depressions in bones sometimes is because another bone will fit right in there. So you can see when I go like this, that mandibular condyle fits nice and snug into the mandibular fossa. Okay, so now let's look. We've got lots of labels on here and even a few that I'll put on in a minute to show you. So here, let's start over here. The cheekbone is going to be the zygoma or the zygomatic bone. And because, again, we want to keep track of our rights and lefts, that is the right zygoma. Here, this is going to be the right maxilla or maxillary bone. And it's important that you know right versus left because the maxilla are actually two bones that are fused together. So, as always, remember your rights and lefts. These two bones here, kind of by the bridge, what you would call the bridge of your nose, those are the nasal bones. And we do have a right and a left. So this is the right, this is the left. That lacrimal bone, I have the left one labeled here. The lacrimal bone is a bit more posterior to that. And again, we have a left and a right. Let me get rid of some of these labels as we talk through them. That might clear things up. Again, on that maxilla, so technically this would be the left maxilla, we have these bony sockets called alveoli. But that word alveolus just means one single raised portion. Okay, so now let's look at these terms here. These are actually a part of the left temporal bone. So this structure right here, the left zygomatic process, remember a process is just something that kind of like juts outwards. So the fact that we have this little part of the bone that kind of comes outwards, that's what makes it a process. So that would be the left zygomatic process. This is the left zygoma or left zygomatic bone. That depression right there is going to be the mandibular fossa. So remember, a fossa is a depression. And to remind ourselves of why it's important to know that, oops, I'll fix that label in a second. That is what the mandibular condyle fits into. So that mandibular condyle fits into the mandibular fossa. Then here, this opening is the external acoustic meatus, the left one specifically. So this is where your pinna or your external ear would be. And that canal, we'll go over the proper terminology when we get to the senses chapter. That's how that connects to your brain, which is pretty interesting. This label that fell off a second ago, that is actually a part of the mastoid process. So again, because we're on the left side of the brain, the skull, that is the left mastoid process. Okay, the last thing I want to show you is the stuff inside here. And this is probably some of the trickiest things to look at because everything kind of meshes together and you really have to look inside. So here we have this structure right here that divides the nasal cavity. And it's important that you know that the superior portion or the top portion is different from the inferior or the bottom portion. So this top half, that is actually going to be the perpendicular plate. And the perpendicular plate is the inferior portion of the ethmoid bone. And if you recall, the ethmoid bone was this bone right here that had the cristagalli and the cribriform plate. So the inferior portion of that is what is called the perpendicular plate, and that's what is made up by that part right there. The inferior portion, or half, however you want to think of it, that is the vomer. So this superior portion, perpendicular plate, inferior portion, vomer. Then we have these little bumps here. Those are called nasal conchae. We can only see the middle and the inferior nasal conchae. Singular would be concha. The superior ones are there, but they're just up inside, are more superior, so we can't visualize it. So on the skulls, you can only visualize the middle and the inferior nasal conchae. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of what all this stuff is on the inside.
Thank you so much for checking out this video. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and go ahead and hit that little bell icon so you don't miss any new content. Please check out my Instagram page @TheAnatomyGal. See you next time.